Throughout history, certain events defy all rational explanation. Witnesses testify to what their own eyes beheld, yet no logical framework can account for what transpired. In the depths of rural Georgia during 1847, a wealthy estate owner known as Baron Wilhelm Vanir conceived what he considered an infallible form of retribution against an enslaved man who had caused him public embarrassment before his elite guests. The scheme appeared straightforward, merciless, and guaranteed to succeed. The man would be confined within a fortified enclosure alongside 6 exceptionally violent bulls from the property, animals that had previously killed 3 men within the span of 2 years, creatures that attacked anything displaying movement. The Baron issued clear instructions. The enslaved man would endure 3 full days without sustenance or hydration. Should he somehow survive, freedom would be his reward, though nobody anticipated he would last even 3 hours. What followed became the most perplexing enigma in the entire county's recorded history. When that enclosure was finally opened after 72 hours had elapsed, the enslaved man emerged completely unscathed. Behind him, all 6 bulls walked out as though they were trained companions, not merely followed but actively refused to depart from his proximity. They had transformed into docile, almost guardian-like beings. Within 14 days, an additional 14 bulls from surrounding estates began materializing at the plantation entrance, serene and compliant, driven by a singular purpose: to remain close to this particular man. 20 bulls in total, all accompanying him, all fundamentally changed. The Baron never spoke of these events again. 3 months afterward, he was discovered deceased in his private study, the door secured from within, his features frozen in an expression of pure terror. As for the enslaved man, he disappeared that very evening, taking nothing except, according to 7 separate witnesses, a procession of 20 bulls that walked soundlessly behind him into the darkness of the Georgia wilderness. This represents the account of what genuinely occurred within that enclosure and why, even today, nobody has successfully explained it. Before we proceed further with the narrative of Tobias and the 20 bulls that followed him into legend, allow me to make a brief request. If you're finding value in this exploration of one of history's most disturbing mysteries, please consider subscribing to my channel. Each week, we present stories of this nature, tales that blur the boundaries between documented historical events and unexplainable phenomena. Show your support by hitting that like button if you want more content like this, and remember to activate notifications so you never miss an episode. Now, let's return to Georgia in 1847 and uncover what truly happened on Baron Vanir's estate. Georgia during the 1840s was a territory where influence was calculated in acres and laborers. The plantation economy had reached its zenith, and individuals like Baron Wilhelm Vanir embodied the absolute dominance of that era. Vanir was not American by birth. He had journeyed from the Netherlands in 1829, bearing a fortune accumulated through the spice trade and a reputation for merciless commercial practices that had enriched him while making him detested throughout European society. Rumors shadowed him across the Atlantic, whispers concerning exploited laborers in Java, vessels that vanished while transporting precious cargo, business associates who had mysteriously perished just before major transactions were completed. None of these allegations were substantiated, yet the pattern was sufficiently clear that respectable Dutch society had quietly excluded him. America, specifically the American South, provided Vanir with something Europe no longer offered, a place where inquiries about someone's past were deemed inappropriate, where wealth commanded more respect than reputation, and where the social framework permitted men of means to exercise virtually unlimited authority over those subordinate to them. He acquired an expansive property near the settlement of Valdosta in southern Georgia, converting it into one of the most lucrative cotton plantations throughout the region. The estate encompassed nearly 3,000 acres of excellent agricultural terrain, bordered by thick pine forests toward the east and the Withlacoochee River toward the west. However, Vanir possessed another fixation beyond cotton, specifically cattle, more precisely bulls. He had cultivated this obsession during his years in Spain, where he had observed bullfighting, and became captivated by the animal's raw strength and ferocity. He commenced importing European breeding stock, particularly aggressive bull breeds utilized in Spain and Portugal for fighting purposes. He believed these creatures represented power and supremacy, characteristics he prized above everything else. His collection of bulls became legendary throughout the county and deeply feared. Workers spoke in hushed tones about the devil's herd, bulls so savage they had claimed 3 men's lives who had attempted to manage them. The initial fatality had occurred in 1845. A worker named Henry, who possessed experience with cattle from his previous plantation, had been assigned the task of relocating one of the bulls to a different pen. The bull, an enormous gray beast Vanir had christened Titan, had appeared calm initially, but the instant Henry entered the pen carrying a lead rope, Titan charged. The assault was so abrupt and brutal that the other workers observing couldn't respond in time. By the moment they managed to divert the bull and extract Henry's body, he was already deceased, his chest crushed, multiple ribs fractured and driven into his lungs. The second death arrived 6 months subsequently. A young man named Peter, barely 20 years of age, had been ordered to feed the bulls. He had approached the pen cautiously, sliding the feed through an opening in the fence, as he had been instructed. But one of the bulls, a black beast with scarred flanks that Vanir called Goliath, had somehow managed to force its head through the gap, catching Peter's arm in its jaws. The bull had pulled with such force that Peter was dragged against the fence, his shoulder dislocating, his arm breaking in 3 places. Other workers had rushed to assist, but during the chaos, Peter had fallen and struck his head against a fence post. He died 2 days later, never regaining consciousness, his arm so severely mangled that the plantation's doctor said even if he had survived, he would have lost the limb. The third death was the most deeply disturbing. A man named Samuel, who had worked with livestock for over 15 years and was considered one of the most experienced handlers on the property, had been tasked with treating an injury on one of the bulls. The animal had sustained a deep cut on its leg, and Vanir wanted it treated to prevent infection. Samuel had approached carefully, speaking softly to the bull, moving slowly. He had managed to get close enough to examine the wound, but when he touched the bull's leg, the animal had exploded into violence. It had reared up, its hooves catching Samuel in the chest and head. The other workers had managed to pull Samuel out, but he had died within minutes, his skull fractured, blood pouring from his ears and nose. Following Samuel's death, Vanir had the pen reinforced with additional iron bars and thicker posts. He also decreed that no worker was to enter the pen under any circumstances. The bulls would be fed from outside through specially designed chutes. Water would be provided through troughs that could be filled from a safe distance. The bulls would live in that pen, isolated and dangerous, a testament to Vanir's wealth and his ability to maintain something that served no practical purpose beyond demonstrating his power. The plantation itself was a world unto itself. Over 200 people lived and worked there, most of them enslaved, their lives controlled entirely by Vanir's whims. The main house was a grand structure built in the Greek Revival style that was popular among wealthy Southerners of the era. White columns, wide verandas, tall windows designed to catch any breeze during the brutal summer months. The house sat on a slight rise, positioned so that Vanir could look out from his second-floor study and see the entire plantation spread before him, the cotton fields stretching toward the horizon, the worker quarters arranged in neat rows, the barns and storage buildings, and far to the east, Bull Pen, a dark square against the tree line. Vanir ruled with calculated cruelty. He was not a man who beat his slaves himself. He considered such behavior beneath his dignity, the mark of someone who had lost control. Instead, he employed an overseer named Dalton, a lean, hard man from South Carolina who had a reputation for efficiency and brutality. Dalton handled the physical enforcement of discipline while Vanir orchestrated the psychological control. He believed in making examples, in creating situations where people would humiliate themselves or each other, in fostering an environment of fear and uncertainty where no one could ever feel secure. He would, for instance, announce that he was considering granting freedom to one of the enslaved workers, then spend weeks having different people audition for the privilege, performing tasks or answering questions, building hope, only to ultimately declare that none of them had proven worthy. Or he would pit workers against each other, promising rewards to whoever produced the most cotton in a week, then finding reasons to disqualify the winner and give the reward to someone else entirely. These games served no purpose beyond his own amusement and the maintenance of absolute control. Among the enslaved population was a man named Tobias. No one knew his age exactly. He appeared to be in his 30s, though his eyes suggested someone much older. He had been purchased at auction in Savannah 5 years earlier, part of a group brought from a plantation in South Carolina that had gone bankrupt after a series of bad harvests and poor investments. The auction records listed him simply as Tobias, male, approximately 30 years, field hand, no known family. But those who had traveled with him from South Carolina told a different story. They said Tobias had been different from the moment they had known him. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words carried weight. He had a way of looking at people that made them uncomfortable, as if he could see past whatever face they were presenting to the world and into something deeper. Some of the other enslaved people from South Carolina claimed that Tobias had been born in Africa, that he had been brought over as a child and still remembered the old ways, the old languages, the old beliefs. Others said he had been born in America, but had been taught by someone who knew those things. A few whispered that he wasn't entirely human, that he was something else wearing a human shape, but these whispers were always quickly silenced. Such talk was dangerous, the kind of thing that could get people accused of practicing forbidden religions or planning rebellions. What everyone agreed on was that Tobias had a strange gift with animals. Horses that were skittish and difficult to manage would calm in his presence. Dogs that barked at everyone else would sit quietly when he approached. Even wild animals seemed to react differently to him. Workers reported seeing him stand perfectly still in the fields while deer grazed nearby, unafraid, or watching as birds would land on his shoulders and arms as if he were a tree. When Vanir had purchased Tobias, he had initially assigned him to field work, but within a week, the stable master, an older free black man named Marcus, had requested that Tobias be reassigned to work with the horses. Marcus had noticed Tobias's effect on the animals and recognized it as something valuable. Vanir had agreed, always willing to maximize efficiency, and Tobias had been moved to the stables. For 5 years, Tobias had worked there quietly and competently. He cared for the horses, maintained the tack and equipment, and occasionally assisted with other livestock when needed. He lived in a small room attached to the stable, separate from the main worker quarters. This isolation suited him. He spent his evenings alone, and on Sundays, when most of the enslaved population gathered for the supervised religious services Vanir allowed, believing that controlled religion kept people docile, Tobias would disappear into the woods, returning only after dark. Some people found this behavior suspicious. Dalton, the overseer, had questioned Tobias about it several times, demanding to know what he was doing in the woods. Tobias had always given the same answer: walking, thinking, praying. It wasn't enough to punish him for. He wasn't breaking any explicit rules, but it marked him as someone to watch. Marcus, the stable master, was one of the few people Tobias spoke to with any regularity. Marcus was in his 60s, a man who had been born into slavery, but had purchased his freedom 20 years earlier through a combination of saved wages and a generous loan from a Quaker merchant who opposed slavery. He had chosen to stay in the South and work for wages, sending money to family members who were still enslaved, hoping to eventually buy their freedom as well. He was a careful man, someone who had learned to navigate the dangerous waters of Southern society without making waves. Marcus had tried on several occasions to draw Tobias out, to learn more about him, but Tobias remained guarded. The most Marcus had ever gotten from him was a single conversation late one night when both men were working in the stable, treating a horse that had developed a bad cough. "You have a gift," Marcus had said, watching as Tobias held his hand on the horse's neck, the animal's breathing gradually steadying. "I've been around horses my whole life, and I've never seen anyone with a touch like yours." Tobias had been silent for a long moment. Then he had said quietly, "It's not a gift, it's understanding." "Understanding what? That they're not so different from us. They feel fear, they feel pain, they want to be safe. If you understand that, really understand it, they know, they can tell." Marcus had nodded slowly. "Where did you learn that?" Tobias had looked at him then, and Marcus had felt that uncomfortable sensation that others had described. The feeling of being seen too clearly. "From someone who understood it better than I do," Tobias had said, "someone who's gone now." He hadn't elaborated, and Marcus hadn't pushed, but the conversation had stayed with him. There was something about Tobias that didn't quite fit the world they lived in. He was too calm, too centered, too unafraid in a place where fear was the primary tool of control. Vanir had noticed Tobias's gift as well, though he interpreted it differently. He saw it as a useful skill, something to be exploited. He had used Tobias several times to handle difficult livestock, always with success, but he also viewed it with suspicion. Vanir didn't like things he couldn't understand, and Tobias's effect on animals felt like something beyond normal skill. It suggested a kind of power, and Vanir couldn't tolerate the idea of anyone on his plantation having power that didn't come directly from him. This tension had been building for 5 years, unspoken but present. And then came the incident that would change everything. The incident that led to Tobias's punishment happened on a warm April evening in 1847. Vanir was hosting a dinner for several prominent plantation owners from neighboring counties. These gatherings were important to him. They were opportunities to display his wealth, to reinforce his position in the social hierarchy, to make business connections and political alliances. He had been planning this particular dinner for weeks, ensuring that every detail would be perfect. The guest list included some of the most powerful men in southern Georgia. There was Colonel James Hartley, who owned a plantation twice the size of Vanir's and had connections to the state legislature. There was Richard Brennan, a wealthy merchant who controlled much of the cotton trade in the region. There was Thomas Fairfax, a lawyer who had successfully defended several plantation owners in legal disputes over property and labor. And there were their wives, elegant women in expensive dresses, who would spend the evening discussing fashion and gossip while the men talked business. The dinner itself was elaborate. Vanir had ordered his cook, an enslaved woman named Ruth, who had trained in Charleston and was known for her skill with French cuisine, to prepare a feast. Roasted duck, venison, fresh fish from the river, vegetables from the plantation's gardens, imported wines, elaborate desserts. The dining room had been decorated with flowers and candles, the silver polished until it gleamed, the crystal glasses arranged precisely. The dinner went well, the food was praised, the wine flowed freely, and the conversation was lively. Vanir held court at the head of the table, telling stories about his travels in Europe and Asia, making jokes at the expense of northern abolitionists, discussing the latest political developments in Washington. He was in his element, performing for an audience that appreciated his wealth and power. After dinner, as was customary, the men retired to Vanir's study for brandy and cigars, while the women remained in the parlor. It was during this time that Vanir made his mistake. He had been drinking heavily, feeling expansive and confident, and he decided to give his guests a tour of his prized bulls. "Gentlemen," he announced, standing and gesturing toward the window, "I have something to show you that I guarantee you've never seen before. The most magnificent and dangerous bulls in all of Georgia, perhaps in all of America." The men followed him outside, carrying their brandy glasses, laughing and talking. It was a pleasant evening, the air warm but not oppressive, a light breeze carrying the scent of jasmine from the gardens. They walked across the grounds, past the worker quarters where people watched silently from windows and doorways, past the cotton fields where the plants were just beginning to show their first growth, toward the eastern edge of the property where the bull pen stood. The pen was an impressive structure, built to contain animals that most men wouldn't dare approach. The fence was constructed of thick wooden posts, each one sunk 4 feet into the ground and reinforced with iron bars. The posts were spaced close together, too close for even a determined bull to force its way through. The gate was equally formidable, made of heavy timber and secured with multiple iron chains and locks. Inside the pen, which measured roughly 60 feet by 40 feet, 6 bulls moved in the fading light. Vanir began describing each bull, pointing them out with obvious pride. "That one there, the gray beast, that's Titan, imported from Spain, killed a man in 1845, crushed his chest like it was made of paper. And that black one, the one with the scars, that's Goliath, Portuguese stock, responsible for 2 deaths. The others are equally dangerous. I keep them here as a reminder of what true power looks like: strength without mercy, dominance without question." The guests murmured appreciatively, though several of them looked uneasy. These were men who understood violence and power, but there was something unsettling about keeping animals this dangerous for no practical purpose beyond display. As Vanir continued his presentation, Goliath began to show signs of agitation. The massive black bull started pawing at the ground, snorting, tossing its head. Then it charged at the fence, slamming into it with tremendous force. The impact was so violent that the entire fence shook, and several of the guests stepped back instinctively. Vanir laughed, clearly pleased by their reaction. "Don't worry, gentlemen, the fence is solid. These beasts can throw themselves against it all day, and they won't break through. I had it built specifically to contain them." Goliath charged again, and this time the other bulls joined in, all of them rushing at the fence, bellowing with rage. The sound was deafening, a chorus of animal fury that echoed across the plantation. The guests were no longer smiling. Even Vanir looked slightly concerned, though he tried to hide it. "They're more agitated than usual," he said, raising his voice to be heard over the noise. "Perhaps they sense the presence of so many people." And then, as if on cue, Tobias appeared. He had been working in the stable, which was located about 50 yards from the bull pen. He had heard the commotion and had come to investigate, thinking perhaps one of the horses had been spooked by the noise. He was carrying a bucket of feed, his work clothes dusty, his expression neutral. The moment Tobias came within 20 feet of the pen, everything changed. The bulls stopped, not gradually, not slowly. They simply stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. Goliath, who had been in mid charge, planted his hooves, and stood perfectly still. The other bulls did the same. The bellowing ceased. The only sound was the evening breeze rustling through the pine trees. The silence was more unsettling than the noise had been. All 6 bulls turned to face Tobias. They didn't move toward him, didn't show any signs of aggression. They simply stood there, watching him with what could only be described as focused attention. Their breathing slowed, their bodies relaxed. It was as if they had forgotten the fence, forgotten the men standing on the other side, forgotten everything except the presence of this one person. Vanir stared at Tobias, his face darkening. The guests looked between Tobias and the bulls, confused and fascinated. Colonel Hartley, who had drunk more brandy than the others and was feeling bold, laughed nervously. "Well, Baron, it seems your slave has more control over your bulls than you do. Perhaps you should have him give them their tour instead." It was meant as a joke, a light-hearted comment to break the tension, but the moment the words left Hartley's mouth, the atmosphere changed. Vanir's expression shifted from confusion to something darker, humiliation mixed with rage. The other guests fell silent, sensing immediately that something had gone wrong. Vanir turned slowly to look at Hartley. "Is that so?" he said quietly. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made everyone uncomfortable. Hartley, realizing his mistake, tried to backtrack. "I meant no offense, Baron. I was simply commenting on the remarkable effect your man seems to have on the animals. It's quite impressive, really, but the damage was done." Vanir had been embarrassed in front of his peers, his authority questioned, his power diminished, and he had been embarrassed by a slave, someone who was supposed to be beneath notice, beneath consideration. This was intolerable. Vanir looked at Tobias, who had frozen in place, understanding immediately that something terrible had just been set in motion. Tobias's face remained neutral, but his eyes showed a flicker of something, not fear exactly, but recognition. He knew what was coming. "Tobias," Vanir said, his voice carrying across the distance between them, "come here." Tobias set down his bucket and walked slowly toward the group of men. He kept his eyes down, his posture submissive, playing the role that was expected of him. But everyone watching could sense that it was a performance, that beneath the surface, Tobias was something other than what he appeared to be. When Tobias reached the fence, Vanir studied him for a long moment. The bulls remained calm, still watching Tobias, still ignoring everything else. "You have a gift with animals," Vanir said. It wasn't a question. "I work with them, sir," Tobias replied quietly. "I've learned their ways." "Learned their ways," Vanir repeated, his tone mocking. "How modest. Colonel Hartley here seems to think you have more control over my bulls than I do." "What do you think about that?" Tobias said nothing. There was no safe answer to that question. Vanir smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I think we should test that theory. I think we should see just how much control you really have." The guests shifted uncomfortably. They could sense where this was going, and none of them liked it. "Baron," Thomas Fairfax said carefully, "perhaps we should return to the house. The evening is getting late." "Nonsense," Vanir interrupted. "The evening is just getting interesting. Gentlemen, I'm going to make a wager with my slave here. A generous wager, in fact." He turned back to Tobias. "Here's my offer. You will spend 3 days in that pen with those bulls. 3 full days. No food, no water, no shelter. If you survive, I will grant you your freedom and give you $50. That's more money than most free men see in a year. You'll be able to go wherever you want, do whatever you want. You'll be a free man." The guests were silent, shocked by the proposal. $50 was indeed a significant sum, and the promise of freedom was something that any enslaved person would desperately want. But the cost was almost certainly death. Everyone there had heard the stories about Vanir's bulls. 3 men had already died. The idea that anyone could survive 3 days locked in with those animals was absurd. "And if I refuse?" Tobias asked quietly. Vanir's smile widened. "Then I'll assume you were lying about your gift, that you're nothing special, Just another slave who got lucky a few times. And I'll have you sold to a plantation in Alabama. I hear they work their people very hard there, much harder than I do. You probably wouldn't last a year. It was a trap, and everyone knew it. If Tobias refused, he would be punished. If he accepted, he would almost certainly die. But there was a third option, one that Vanir hadn't considered. Tobias might actually survive, and if he did, Vanir would be forced to honor his word in front of witnesses or risk losing face among his peers. Tobias looked at the bulls, still standing calmly in the pen, still watching him. Then he looked back at Vanir. I accept, he said. Vanir's smile faltered for just a moment, as if he hadn't expected Tobias to agree so readily, but he recovered quickly. Excellent. We'll begin tomorrow at dawn. I want everyone on the plantation to witness this. It will be educational. The guests were quiet as they walked back to the main house. The evening's entertainment had taken a dark turn, and none of them were comfortable with what they had just witnessed. But none of them spoke up to stop it either. This was Vanir's property, his slave, his decision. To interfere would be to question his authority, and that was something none of them were willing to do. That night, word spread quickly through the plantation about what was going to happen. Workers gathered in small groups, whispering, speculating. Some thought Tobias was brave. Others thought he was foolish. A few thought he might actually survive, though they couldn't explain why they believed that. Marcus, the stable master, sought out Tobias in his room attached to the stable. You don't have to do this, Marcus said. We could find a way to get you out of here. There are people who help runaways. I know some names, some places. No, Tobias said calmly. Running would only make things worse for me and for everyone else here. Vanir would take his anger out on all of you. But those bulls, I know, Tobias said. I've known since the moment I arrived here that something like this would happen eventually. Men like Vanir, they can't tolerate what they don't understand, and they especially can't tolerate it when it makes them look weak. Marcus sat down heavily on a wooden crate. So you're just going to walk into that pen and die? Tobias looked at him, and Marcus saw something in his eyes that he couldn't quite identify. Not fear, not resignation, but something else. Something that looked almost like certainty. I'm going to walk into that pen, Tobias said quietly. What happens after that, we'll see. The next morning arrived with a gray dawn, clouds obscuring the sun, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Vanir had ordered the entire plantation to gather near the bullpen. This was to be a public event, a demonstration of his power and a warning to anyone who might think about challenging his authority. Over 200 people assembled in a loose semicircle around the pen. The enslaved workers stood in groups, their faces carefully neutral, knowing that any visible emotion could be interpreted as sympathy for Tobias and result in punishment. The overseers and managers stood closer to the pen, armed with rifles and whips, ready to intervene if the bulls somehow managed to break through the fence. Vanir's house servants stood near the main house, watching from a distance. Even Margaret had come out, standing on the veranda with her personal maid, her face pale. Vanir himself stood directly in front of the pen's gate, dressed in his finest clothes, as if this were a formal occasion. Beside him stood Dalton, holding the keys to the gate's locks. Several of the guests from the previous night had stayed over, and they stood nearby, looking uncomfortable but unwilling to leave. To depart now would be to insult Vanir, and none of them could afford that. Tobias was brought forward by two overseers. He was wearing the same simple work clothes he had had on the night before, canvas pants, a rough cotton shirt, worn boots. His hands were unbound. He looked at the pen, at the bulls moving restlessly inside, then at Vanir. 3 days, Vanir announced loudly, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. 72 hours. If you survive, you walk free with $50 in your pocket. If you die, he shrugged, well, "You should have been more careful around my bulls." A few of the overseers laughed, but the sound was forced, uncomfortable. Most of the crowd remained silent. Vanir nodded to Dalton, who stepped forward and began unlocking the gate. The chains rattled as they were removed, the sound loud in the morning quiet. The gate swung open with a creak of hinges. "In you go," Vanir said. Tobias walked forward without hesitation. He stepped through the gate and into the pen, his movements calm and deliberate. The moment he was inside, Dalton swung the gate shut and locked it, the chains rattling back into place. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. The bulls, which had been moving around the pen, stopped and turned to look at Tobias. He stood near the center of the enclosure, not moving, barely breathing. His eyes were closed, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. He looked like a man in prayer or in meditation, completely still. The crowd watched in tense silence. Some people were holding their breath. Others were whispering prayers. A few of the children who had been brought to witness this were crying, being shushed by their parents. Then Goliath, the massive black bull that had killed 2 men, began to move. It lowered its head, pawing at the ground, its muscles tensing. Everyone watching recognized the signs. The bull was preparing to charge. Several people in the crowd gasped. One woman screamed. Vanir leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Tobias, a slight smile on his face. Goliath charged. The bull rushed forward with terrifying speed, its hooves thundering against the packed earth, its head lowered, its horns aimed directly at Tobias. It covered the distance in seconds, and for a moment it seemed certain that Tobias would be gored, trampled, killed instantly. But then, just as Goliath was about to make contact, Tobias opened his eyes. He raised one hand, palm out, and made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a song, something in between. It was low and resonant, seeming to come from deep in his chest, and it carried across the pen with strange clarity. Goliath stopped. The bull's momentum should have carried it forward. It should have been physically impossible for an animal that size, moving that fast, to stop so suddenly. But Goliath planted its hooves and stood perfectly still, 3 feet away from Tobias, breathing heavily, staring at him with dark, liquid eyes. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Vanir's smile disappeared. He took a step closer to the fence, his hands gripping the iron bars. The other 5 bulls approached slowly, forming a loose circle around Tobias and Goliath. They didn't charge, they didn't threaten. They simply moved closer, their heads lowered, their eyes fixed on Tobias. Tobias stood there for a long moment, his hand still raised, that strange sound still emanating from him. Then slowly, he lowered his hand and took a single step toward Goliath. The bull didn't move. Tobias took another step, and another, until he was standing directly in front of the massive animal. He reached out and placed his hand on Goliath's forehead, right between the bull's eyes. The effect was immediate and profound. Goliath's entire body seemed to relax, the tension drained from its muscles. Its breathing slowed and deepened. The bull closed its eyes, leaning slightly into Tobias's touch like a dog being petted by its owner. The other bulls moved closer, surrounding Tobias in a tight circle, but there was no aggression in their movements. They were calm, almost gentle, their massive bodies moving with careful precision to avoid bumping into each other or into Tobias. Vanir stared at the scene, his face pale, his jaw clenched. This wasn't what he had expected. This wasn't what was supposed to happen. The bulls were supposed to kill Tobias within hours, if not minutes. Instead, they were acting like pets, like domesticated animals that had known Tobias their entire lives. "Give it time," Vanir muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "They'll turn on him when he sleeps, when he shows weakness. They'll kill him then." But as the hours passed, it became clear that wasn't going to happen. Tobias remained in the center of the pen, sometimes standing, sometimes sitting cross-legged on the ground, sometimes walking slowly in small circles. The bulls stayed near him, maintaining a respectful distance of a few feet but never leaving. They didn't show any signs of aggression. They didn't charge the fence. They didn't fight with each other. They simply existed in a state of profound calm, their attention always focused on Tobias, as if he were the center of their entire world.